For centuries, humanity was taught that Eve came from Adam's rib, a story repeated so often that it became an unquestioned truth, more dogma than metaphor. But what if that was never actually written in the Bible? What if the original Hebrew text never mentioned a rib at all, but something much deeper and more symbolic? This small mistranslation has shaped how the world sees women, the divine feminine, and even the balance between spirit and flesh. The Hebrew word used in Genesis is ṣēlā, not rib. This seemingly minor detail, ignored for generations, dramatically shifts our understanding of the creation story. The consequences of this translation go far beyond linguistics. They touch theology, power, and spiritual identity. What if Eve wasn't made from a bone, but from something much more essential half of Adam's very being? The word ṣēlā appears over 40 times in the Torah. In nearly every instance, it means side, especially in descriptions of sacred architecture, like the tabernacle or Solomon's temple. It refers to structural sides panels, walls, staircases not, ribs. Yet in Genesis 2:21, it was translated uniquely as rib and only there. Scholars have long questioned this exception. Was it truly an error or a deliberate act driven by cultural and theological motives? When the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BCE, it was done within a Hellenistic culture that already viewed the feminine with deep suspicion. Plato described the soul as originally androgynous, but still placed reason in the eye, domain of the masculine, and emotion in the feminine. Aristotle went further, claiming women were simply incomplete men. Within this framework, the translators chose the Greek word pleura, which could mean side or rib. Later, in the Latin Vulgate, this became costa-definitely rib. This subtle linguistic twist demoted Eve from being Adam's equal half to being a lesser fragment in Jewish mysticism. However, this was never the interpretation. The Zohar and other Kabbalistic texts saw ṣēlā not as a rib, but as the spiritual side of Adam, the unfolding of divine polarity into masculine and feminine. The act of separating Adam into two was not seen as a literal amputation, but as a mystical division. Woman was not a fragment, but a reflection equal and opposite. Even 19th century Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch observed that ṣēlā refers to one side of a symmetrical structure, meaning Eve was made from Adam's side, not below or behind him, but as his counterpart. Together, they form a whole. This perspective, echoed in esoteric and mystical traditions, views the feminine as the visible expression of a previously hidden divine principle. Seen this way, Genesis is no longer a primitive tale of origins. It becomes a spiritual manual describing the journey of the human soul first united, then divided for the purpose of reflection and reunion. The original human wasn't male, but a complete, undivided being. The separation was a necessary step for consciousness, relationship, and self-awareness. Genesis 1:27 already hints at this. God created Ha-Adam in his image. Male and female, he created them. Ha-Adam is not a male name, it means the human, derived from Adama, the fertile ground. This original being contained both masculine and feminine, reflecting the fullness of the divine. Only later, in Genesis 2, does God divide this being into two? And crucially, what is taken from Adam is not a bone, but a side. This theme is not unique to the Bible. In Plato's Symposium, we hear of androgynous beings who were split in two by the gods, forever searching for their other half. The story echoes across cultures, the original unity, the separation, the longing for return. In Genesis, separation is not punishment, it's the spark of relationship, of encounter, of love. Hebrew spirituality maintains this idea. The sacred lies in otherness. The Zohar describes Adam Kadmon, the archetypal human, not as flesh and bone but as light, a dual being containing masculine, Zeter Anpin, and feminine, Nukva, aspects. Their separation was a cosmic necessity, not a fall, and their reunion within heaven and the human soul is the source of blessing. Carl Jung, deeply influenced by mystical and Eastern traditions, understood this spiritual psychology. He believed every man carries an inner feminine, anima, and every woman an inner masculine, animus. Only by integrating these opposites can a person become whole. The Genesis separation was the beginning of the path, not a loss, but the start of INDIV, IDUATI. Own God mystics across time saw the same truth. The split was never about hierarchy, but about reflection. Yet over time, that split was misunderstood. Masculine and feminine were turned into roles of domination and submission. The feminine was reduced to a rib secondary, expendable. The mistranslation became a myth of control. Jacques Derrida once said every translation is a betrayal. Translating ṣēlā as rib betrayed not just the Hebrew language, but the spiritual balance it conveyed. Correcting this isn't merely academic, it's a reclaiming of a sacred truth. Before there was division, there was unity, and every spiritual quest is ultimately a return to that wholeness. The ancient traditions saw the divine not in separation, but in union. The Hindu image of Ardhanarishva half Shiva, half Shakti captures this, a being both male and female, expressing divine harmony. In this light, Genesis shows us that humanity is a bridge between opposites, and that love is the journey home. Eve was never a rib. She was the unveiling of Adam's hidden face, the sacred mirror. Their separation wasn't a fall, but a call-in to remember that they were once one. What was taken from Adam was not flesh, it was light, spirit, and the power to see oneself through the eyes of another. Even the verbs used in Genesis hint at something deeper. When God creates Adam, the Hebrew verb means to form, like molding clay. But when he creates Eve, the verb is vayivan, to build, to architect. This verb is used for constructing temples and cities, not bodies. Eve wasn't shaped like a pot. She was built like a sanctuary. That small shift in language says everything. Eve is not a remedy for Adam's loneliness. She is his revelation. The feminine is not an accessory to the masculine, but its echo, its reflection, its equal. The architecture of humanity is sacred, and woman is not the bone. She is the blueprint. In the original Hebrew, Eve is called Shava, a name that stems from the root Shah, meaning life. The text tells us that Adam named her this because she became the mother of all living. But Shava also carries deeper linguistic roots. In ancient Aramaic, it connects to words meaning to reveal, to manifest, to declare. Eve is not just the giver of life, she is the revealer of what was hidden. This interpretation echoes powerfully in Kabbalistic tradition, where Eve is not seen simply as a physical companion to Adam, but as the external expression of his inner self, the revealed face of the invisible soul. She is not an addition, but a revelation. In this mystical understanding, the feminine gives body to spirit, form to breath, flesh to light. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, a central figure in 16th century Kabbalah, wrote that the feminine is the vessel for divine light, not because it is inferior, but because it is necessary. Without form, light scatters. Without a container, creation dissolves. Eve represents this sacred vessel, this architecture of divine revelation. That is why, in mystical traditions, the feminine is closely associated with Shekinah, the immanent divine presence. Shekinah is not just a part of God, it is God. As present in the world, it is God made tangible. In this light, Eve becomes a personification of Shekinah, divinity taking form, spirit becoming flesh. Eve, then, is not just the first woman, She is the first incarnation of sacred visibility. And this is why, in so many traditions, the feminine is veiled, protected, even feared. What reveals the divine most clearly is also what threatens systems of control. The demonization of the feminine, which would take hold later through the myth of temptation, begins with a failure to understand Eve's true role. Rather than being honored as the revealer of sacred presence, she was recast as the temptress, the accomplice of downfall, a symbolic betrayal that inverted her divine purpose. Yet traces of the original meaning persist. In the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, we find this remarkable line: "The world cannot see the Lord without the woman. A woman is the force of revelation." The same idea appears in the writings of the 13th century Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, who wrote that every soul is feminine before God, for it is in the feminine that the divine makes itself known. In Tantric Hinduism, the sacred is never complete without Shakti, the divine feminine energy. Shiva without Shakti is pure but inert. It is only when Shakti moves that the universe awakens. Eve, too, is Shakti. She is the movement that gives motion to the stillness, the sound that breaks silence, the presence that grounds the transcendent. This is echoed again in the Gnostic figure of Sophia, the divine wisdom. Sophia descends from the higher realms in an attempt to give form to light. Her fall is not failure, but revelation. She is not punished, she is necessary. She is Eve by another name, the one who chooses visibility over comfort, separation over dormancy, the one who manifests divine essence in the material world. Eve is not just the mother of life. She is its mirror, its language, its breath. Jungian psychology picks up this same archetypal thread. Both Carl Jung and his disciple Tony Wolff described the feminine not only in terms of mother or lover, but as the channel of mystery. Woman, in her symbolic dimension, is the medium through which the unconscious becomes conscious. Eve is not a person, she is a bridge. She connects the unseen to the seen. She is the translator of soul into story. And all of this the mystery. The revelation, the mythic function, was stripped away in a single breath. A mistranslation turned Shava the revealer into Eve the guilty. The living soul became the symbol of sin, yet the truth has always pulsed beneath the surface. In texts like the Gospel of Philip and the echoes of ancient Kabbalah, in tantric verses and mystical visions, the feminine is never truly gone. It simply hides in the shadows. Even after being reshaped by centuries of control, the symbol of Eve still flickers. What she reveals is not just woman, but the world's forgotten soul. She is the divine looking at us through the mirror. Every spiritual fall begins when symbols are flattened, when myth is forced into doctrine, when poetry is treated like law. Genesis, if read as sacred metaphor, tells a story of creation, division, and divine unfolding. But once translated rigidly, interpreted dogmatically, it becomes a justification for spiritual hierarchy and gender exclusion. The one who symbolized the divine presence was redefined as derivative, dependent, and dangerous. This distortion allowed sacred language to become deeply masculine, almost exclusively. God was spoken of as Father, King, Lord. The maternal disappeared figures, like Isis, Inanna, and Shakti, were erased, or worse, turned into symbols of seduction and sin. In Hebrew, Eve was life. But through the lens of medieval Christianity, she became the bringer of death, the source of temptation. This wasn't in the original text. It was crystallized by theologians like Tertullian and Augustine. Tertullian called woman the devil's gateway, the one who broke divine law. Such rhetoric wasn't just misogynistic, it was spiritual control. The feminine was removed from ritual spaces, spiritual authority, and sacred vocabulary. The soul became a battlefield instead of a womb. Spirituality was no longer reunion, it became conquest. But even then, the feminine never fully disappeared. In the secret corridors of mysticism, the hidden tradition remained alive. Kabbalah preserved Shekinah as central, Christian esoteric. Circles Rosicrucians, alchemists, mystics sought to restore Sophia, to balance Christ and soul. Eastern paths like Tantra, Taoism, and Vajrayana Buddhism maintained the holiness of sacred duality. These traditions never saw the world as fallen or evil. They saw it as the dance of polarities. They knew the fall wasn't a curse, but a passage. Sin wasn't disobedience. It was forgetting that modern spirituality is beginning to remember what ancient mystics always knew. The imbalance between masculine and feminine is not just societal, it is spiritual. Exalting one while rejecting the other creates fragmentation. Spirituality becomes control, not connection. Language becomes law, not revelation. The true fall is not Eve eating the fruit. It is our failure to understand the symbol. It is our rush to blame instead of contemplate. Jung called this the loss of symbolic function. When we turn myth into literal dogma, we kill the myth, and with it, we lose the key to integration. To heal, we must redeem the symbol, reawaken the mystery, reclaim the archetype. That's why these myths are re-emerging today. We are not just curious, we are spiritually hungry. The sacred feminine is returning. In Eve, in Isis, in Sophia, in Mary, in Shekinah. She never disappeared, she was only veiled. True restoration won't come by denying the masculine. It will come through reconciliation. What was divided must be reunited. What was exiled must return. Language itself must begin to heal the wounds it once opened. The rib of Adam was never just a bone. It was a symbol, a doorway, a riddle, a message from the other side. Genesis holds within it a secret. The soul is beyond gender, but it needs polarity to become conscious. When Eve was named life, the word meant more than existence. It meant revelation. In her, the divine touched the world. And through her, we remember what we were before the fall hole mirrored alive.